broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to our quarterly webinar. Today we are going to be talking about cybersecurity tips, safeguarding your association's sensitive data. My name is Mohammed Saliani. I'm a principal here and I am going to be your moderator. Your speaker for today is Tom Hazard. He is a service manager, IT service manager at our firm here. So we will have a few housekeeping rules before we begin. First of all, to ask any questions, please use the questions pane in the GoWebinar dashboard on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, and if we cannot get to your question, we will get back to you after the webinar. We will be polling our audience throughout the presentation. This will help us get a sense of the participants and their experience. The webinar is going to be recorded and will be uploaded onto our website www.wgcpas.com. It may take us a couple of days to do that. All right, Tom, take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. This whole article and this presentation came out of, a desire from a lot of people across the industry to understand how to, better assess their cybersecurity position and how to understand, securing their infrastructure and feeling like they're doing what they need to be doing. So to start out, let's just talk about where we are in 2017. There's been daily reports of breaches. We've had organizations, obviously, like Equifax is the one big in the news. We've had, trusted providers like Deloitte. We've had, big information brokers like Dun & Bradstreet that have had breaches. There's a growing public perception that, security as we sort of understood it previously is a myth. You can't actually have confidential information anymore. It's just a question of, this is my data and it's been breached so many times that I'm sure everybody has a full copy at this point. There's been a continued evolution of both defenses and attacks. On the defense side, we are seeing more and more next-gen antivirus, which is leveraging things like machine learning and big data analytics to really get more performant and more reliable security protection. And the targets of the attacks have been broadening to include devices that aren't as well protected. A good example of this was a large attack that was made against the internet last year that leveraged a large number of security cameras. These days, everybody wants to have something as, I can access it when I'm not home. I can have an app that interfaces with it. Well, that requires the Internet of Things, the IoT. And that means that all those devices are connected to the internet. And they're typically not as well maintained as, say, your computer. And that means that that device can then be used to either leverage an attack on something else, or even scarier, be used as a jump-off point to get inside your private network, which is something that we really don't want.
So we have our first polling question here. How many records of personally identifiable information were breached in the first half of 2017, not counting Equifax? So take your wildest guess here. All right, we're going to give you a few more seconds here. All right, we'll close that. And the answer is 1.9 billion. Tom, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's absolutely unheard of. So 2016 was, a pretty bad year for breaches. We had about, the number was around 2.4 billion records over the course of the year that were compromised. 2017 started with some pretty big breaches, and of course there have been some even bigger breaches later in the year. So at this point, most experts are thinking we're going to fall somewhere in the around 5 billion record mark at the end of the year. And basically, the reason we want to bring this up so early is we want to make sure everybody understands the severity of what we're dealing with. So we'll just talk briefly about the traditional approach to securing your infrastructure. Typically, you would have a strong network firewall that's protecting you from the internet and trying to restrict the amount of things that are making it into your trusted environment. You're going to have antivirus software in place, hopefully a modern or next-gen antivirus software that is not only matching software against signatures, the more traditional antivirus, but is also looking at the way code behaves as it's running on your computer. So something that is a little more innocuous, like let's say a Word document or an Adobe document, when you open it, it can have a malicious payload in it. And even though Adobe.exe is a trusted application, the malicious code that's trying to run inside it can be identified and quarantined correctly. And obviously, we want to make sure that we're installing updates that are released by manufacturers, both for your operating system and the applications that you use. This is something that we'll get into a little more detail with when we talk about some of the breaches that happened this year, but that's a critical security step. So everything here is important, but they just really aren't good enough to keep up with modern threats, simply because there's some challenges associated with protecting against the more socially engineered attacks.
Hey, Tom, we have a question that's come up here. Why do you need both a firewall and antivirus?
So that's a great question. So it's really important when you're designing security protection, especially, that you go for a layered defense model. So what that means is, if we're trying to protect against malware that exists on the open internet, obviously we want to have a firewall in place that's going to filter, 98% of, whatever is trying to attack us from the outside. Then all we need to worry about is that remaining 2%, and we're going to use, the best antivirus that we can find to make sure that, that remainder gets addressed on that system. Whereas if you don't have a firewall, you're just going to be exposing your computer to 100% of the attacks and hoping your antivirus is strong enough, which is never the right choice.
Okay.
So we just want to talk about ransomware quickly. Probably most of you are already familiar with what ransomware is. If you're not, basically it's a type of malware that leverages encryption, which is normally something good for you, to make it so that you can't access your data. So this malware is going to go in, it's going to basically obfuscate all of your data from you so that you can't see it, and then it's going to post a ransom note like what you see on the left side of the slide here. I always kind of enjoy this image. I don't know if it's coming through on the webinar, but you can see that it welcomes you to the community of CryptoWall. And this is actually a legitimate ransom note that you get from the CryptoWall variant of ransomware. So this is, probably one of the biggest types of attacks, really because it makes money. And the amount of money that's been made, has been billions for a couple of years now. So, there are most parts of the world, if you're a software engineer, you'll actually make more money per year writing code for ransomware and selling it, not even using the attack yourself, just selling your code, than you would writing a legitimate application. So that's why this is just a crazy growing environment. Most of the time you're going to get this from an email, either in the form of a link that you click on that takes you to a malicious website, or as a file attachment, like I said, a Word document or an Adobe document that's been compromised, and that is exploiting some attack that either isn't patched or you haven't patched yet on your computer. And the reason this is also on the rise is because, especially in the US, the FBI did a survey to try to understand a little bit more about what was going on with ransomware, and they found that 64% of the people surveyed, which is I think about 10,000 people, said that they would be willing to pay the ransomware if critical data was encrypted and they couldn't get it back. And more, these ransomware vendors are realizing that most of us are relying on our backup systems to prevent us from having to actually pay the ransom. And so they're finding out what those backup systems are, specifically targeting them, encrypting them first, and then going after our real data. So when you go to your backups to avoid paying the ransom, you realize that you can't. Again, this is a $5 billion business estimated to be in 2017. It was somewhere in, I think, around the $4 billion mark last year, and it's only going to continue to grow. And because this has been so successful, the average ransom amount being demanded is up 266% from 2016. It used to be you'd usually get your files back for around $100 US. Now we're well over 1,000, in some cases in the 5-figure range. So we want to talk about email for a little bit. Email is obviously an extremely prevalent technology. We all rely on it. We all probably get hundreds of emails a day, both professionally and personally. And a lot of people don't really understand technically how it works, and that is exploited by attackers to perpetrate some attacks. So email is really not private. There are some technologies like encrypted email that can establish some privacy, but just a regular email that you're sending from one person to another, you should have no expectation that that email or anything attached to it is private. Anyone in the open internet will be able to see that, very similar to if you send a postcard. Anybody who opens your mailbox can see what's on it. Anybody who sees that postcard while it's transiting through the postal system can see it, and anybody at the recipient side who isn't the recipient can see it. So it's really important to make sure that you understand that anything in that email, including attachments, is not private. The other key is that it's not authenticated. So there is a technology called digital signatures that can be used to provide some what's called non-repudiation or verifiable information that the sender is legitimate. But for a general email that doesn't have that little medal next to it, the from address can be fraudulently made literally anything. Just this morning, we got an email from an internal staff member who was very upset that they thought that their email had been hacked. And in reality, somebody had sent an email purporting to be one of our users to one of our other users, asking them, of course, oh, please click on this link. I need you to do this urgently. And it was just trying to manipulate someone into thinking, oh, this is somebody important in the organization. I better click on this link. I better do what we need to do. And in most security circles, email is considered the single greatest threat to organizational security, so much so that in some verticals are actually considering restricting or removing access to email for really sensitive personnel. So getting into specifically email attacks, they all kind of fall under the umbrella category of business email compromise. This is typically referred to as phishing or CEO fraud or spear phishing. They're all types of email compromise. So phishing is just generally somebody trying to use email to, basically con you into doing something. This is no different from getting a letter in the old days that said, oh, hey, you've won $1 million. Call this number and give me your information, and you'll have your money. CEO fraud is what we were talking about with that example from earlier today that we had, where someone is going to purport to be someone in a position of authority and try to go after someone else and leverage that position of authority to motivate them to do something that they shouldn't. And spear phishing is basically taking information that's publicly available on the internet, be it LinkedIn or Facebook or what have you, and leveraging that information to basically make a very specifically targeted attack that looks very legitimate. And some of these can be really scary. So again, attackers are going to pose as an authority or somebody and create this sort of urgent situation that you need to settle. The FBI estimates that this was a $2.3 billion loss due to financial transactions authorized via email. And in most cases with this type of attack, cyber insurance or corporate general liability insurance doesn't cover it because it's considered voluntary parting. You didn't do your due diligence to verify who was asking for the transaction, so it's not on the banks or the law enforcement to really help you out in that situation. So we're just going to look quickly at a sample email. This one in particular is after your credentials to an email service, which obviously once they have, they'll then use to email your colleagues or the business partners that you have to try to phish them. So you'll see typically they're going to leverage a familiar brand. So in this case, Microsoft Outlook, we all know what that is. And they're going to use a domain that's called a homograph that, out1ook.com looks very similar to outlook.com, which is what you would expect to receive this email from. So even if you're vigilant and you look beyond just the friendly name of who sent it, that email address might pass muster quickly because we get a lot of email and we don't always read very carefully. So it's telling us our password's been expired, and for our security, we need to cease work shortly, which is again a little bit strange phraseology. Fortunately, a lot of these messages are sourcing internationally, so their English isn't great. So that's always a good way to try to filter out the bad stuff. Now required to change your password immediately. Strange keyword, and then the service again that it takes you to. It looks like service.outlook.com, but when you actually mouse over the link and hover there, the URL that pops up that'll actually take you to is, again, that same malicious domain. So you want to be really careful whenever you're looking at a URL that if you're getting something from a source like, American Express, it's actually taking you to americanexpress.com, not, something else.
Yeah, but by the way, I think I've decided that I'm going to only allow communication through snail mail anymore. So any of you who want to speak to me or communicate with me, send me snail mail. I'm just kidding. Anyway, but we do have a question here. How do you check shortened URLs?
So URL shortening is a problem because it's a legitimate tool that's used, especially in Twitter and social media, to basically take a long URL like the one that you see there on that slide and make it something like tiny URL or bit.ly and then a random string after it. And then when you click on that, it redirects you to where you're actually going. So it's really important whenever you get an email that uses one of those URL shorteners that you go to the shortener's website, and most of them have an ability that you can paste the code in that link, and it will tell you where it's actually taking you. In some places, I think Amazon is a big offender with this, they shorten their URLs to a.co, which looks illegitimate. But when you take it to their URL website, you can actually reveal what it is and realize that it's legitimate. So in addition to email fraud, there's in general some challenges with social engineering, and this is email compromise related, but more and more we keep seeing stories of people that have been experiencing something called phishing. And phishing is a industry term for voice-based phishing. So someone's going to call you on the phone with caller ID that looks legitimate and ask you for personally identifiable information, and a lot of people fall victim to that. So you'll get a call on your cell phone, it looks like it's from Bank of America, they're calling you about your checking account, they ask for your social security number to verify it. And I actually had a call from a legitimate bank that was basically asking me that information, and I refused to give it to them. I asked for the number that I should call back on so that I could verify that number on the bank's website and then give my information that way. So it's just really important to remember that fraud is fraud, and it can happen in snail mail, it can happen in email, it can happen in phone. We have a traditional suspicion with someone we see on the street, and with our snail mail, we just need to extend that suspicion into our technological tools.
So in other words, we're not protected.
No. You might feel a little bit safer using something more familiar, but everything's an attackable surface if the attacker knows enough about it. And that's the real issue with the second point. Breaches like Dun & Bradstreet and Equifax, not only are they bad because your personally identifiable information is out there, they're also bad because now all these attackers know that much more about you and about those that you work with, so they can have even more reliable information with which to phish you. So they may be able to use someone's nickname. They may be able to get in somebody else's email inbox, pull their email signature, and send you an email using their legitimate current signature to create that additional layer of trust. So you really have to be super careful. Social media is another big source. LinkedIn is a treasure trove of information from an attacker standpoint. All you have to do is search in LinkedIn the business name, and you can see titles for everyone. So you know who the CEO is, you know who the controller is, you know everybody who's in the authorization structure for financial transactions, and then you can attack that structure. So strong authorization procedures is really critical for this kind of thing. And what that really means is, yeah, it's convenient to be able to email around inside your organization and say, hey, process this transaction or do this thing. But you really want to have some sort of out-of-band communication that happens every time a financial transaction is happening. Internally in the firm here, we actually require a verbal conversation with our managing shareholder before any wires happen. Some organizations that's practical because you don't do it very often. Other organizations you do hundreds a day, and that's simply not feasible. So you really need to think about your organization, how you use the wiring process, and build again a layered defense around that to really try to protect that process and make sure that you don't accidentally send money to the wrong person. Data breaches. So we've had some data breaches this year, of course. We've got our 1.9 billion records, plus another billion or so since then. And it's important to think about those breaches as an end user, not only as, well, my information is out there, but as other openings that creates in your personal security. So a great example of this is the DocuSign breach that happened earlier this year. It was a very small breach, only happened for, I think, about 24 hours. But what the attacker did is they compromised a DocuSign email system and a DocuSign web server, and they sent an email from a legitimate DocuSign account with a legitimate DocuSign.com URL, and when you clicked on it, it took you to a malicious web page that downloaded ransomware, I believe. And this particular attack was extremely effective because DocuSign is a trusted brand. Like, you would never think that anything originating from inside their corporate perimeter would be compromised. So whenever you hear about, a trusted provider like that having a compromised network, you really need to be extra careful whenever you're corresponding with them to make sure that that's actually the person that you're talking to. And then, like I was alluding to earlier, if an email account is compromised, I'm sure all of you get probably at least 5 emails a year from a business contact that says, hey, my email was compromised, sorry you got any emails, please delete them, we're working on resolving it. Well, when that happens, not only did you get that malicious email or whatever the attacker was after, but the attacker got a snapshot of all of your communication with that person and that person's communication with all of their business contacts that they can then use to craft really effective spear phishing. So especially when you're dealing with a business partner that has that kind of compromise, that means you need to be that much more careful when working with emails purporting to be from that organization going forward. Poor configuration and maintenance were a really big theme. I'm sure most of you heard the testimony from the former Equifax CEO, where he told Congress that one IT person in their organization was responsible for the fact that one security patch wasn't installed, which resulted in the breach that cost them all of their data. Obviously that's a failure of security controls on many levels. They should have some sort of automated system that's checking to see if those vulnerabilities are out there. They should have an automated system that's installing those updates. And they should have more than one person as a redundancy to make sure that work happens. But it's really important when you're thinking about this from an organizational standpoint that you're really designing your security system, your security ecosystem, so that there's checks and balances and you're not relying on any one single point of failure that can result in you being compromised. It's also kind of shocking to me that physical theft is still a very frequent cause of breaches, especially in the healthcare sector. And the reason this is surprising is, 5 years ago, encrypting a laptop was a significant performance hit. It made your laptop slower, it required special hardware, it was just not very convenient. And most mobile devices either didn't support encryption, or if they did, it was also kind of awkward to work with. But these days, every device that's Windows 10 has BitLocker available and can be encrypted with a couple clicks. Most mobile phones are encrypted out of the box and simply require a password set to help protect that encryption. But for whatever reason, organizations really aren't taking that step and aren't securing their information, and it's resulting in data breaches. So I encourage everyone to think about the mobile devices, especially that they use, and if there's a way that they can encrypt those devices to protect against, if the worst happening, it gets stolen, will that information be compromised?
All right, so we have our second polling question here. What percentage of breaches in 2017 involved a weak or compromised password? All right, we're going to give you a few more seconds. All right, we'll close the voting here. All right, so the answer is 81%.
So Verizon does a really great service to the security world in that they release this incident response sort of executive summary every year that goes into a lot of detail on the trends that they're seeing in their incident response. And from that survey, we found that 81% of these attacks were from weak or compromised passwords. And the one thing before we move more into password security, I just want to highlight that compromised password point. So again, we were talking about breaches and how breaches expose other information that can be important. Well, in the case of like the Yahoo breach that happened a couple of years ago, that breach was actually your credentials. So your email address and your password was compromised. And if you use that password in other places, now those other places' passwords were compromised as well. So how do we use passwords safely? Passwords obviously only really work when they're unknown to anyone other than you. As soon as anybody else can either guess it or know what it is, that password is basically useless. So strong passwords are generally considered, to be difficult for humans and computers to guess. They're long, they're not guessable, no simple substitutions. So if you say, oh, well, my password isn't readily guessable because it's, one password with, a 0 in it for the O's. Like, that's a very common character replacement, and it's, anybody who's guessing a password is going to be looking for that. You want to make sure that they're unique to one site or application. Like I said with the breach passwords with Yahoo, if you use that same password in another place, now it's compromised. If you don't, if you really do use a unique password for every site, then you're that much more secure. And a strong password is generally considered to be impossible to remember. So that's where using something like a password manager comes into play. LastPass is an example, OnePass is another. And the idea there is you're going to create one really strong master password that you have to remember. And then all the other passwords for all of your other websites are all stored in that vault. And then they'll, you can either get them quickly, or the software will actually autofill them into the website. So you just, open the website, it autofills your credentials, you hit login, and it logs you in. And it has some feature to generate a password randomly for each site that you connect to. Another great feature of these kind of websites is they typically have a tool that will help you sort of assess your own security. So it can go through and say, hey, your master password is in use on these 3 websites, and you're reusing this password on these 4 websites. And it just sort of helps keep you on the straight and narrow from a security standpoint. One thing that's interesting about passwords is NIST actually published earlier this year their new password standards. You can thank NIST for that 7-character, 3-character class, changes every 90 days standard that was published probably about a decade ago. And the author of those standards has actually come out and said that that's one of his biggest professional mistakes, and he really regrets doing it. So the new standards are really focused more on making it easier for the user to remember their password, use things like passphrases, which is a combination of words instead of a combination of characters, to establish a longer password, but without it being harder to remember. So we just kind of want to see what people think a good password is.
So here's your third question for this presentation. Which of these passwords is currently considered the most secure? So go ahead and vote on that. Let's see what you think. All right, so we've closed that, and let's see what's the answer here.
So the answer here is a little bit complicated. So what is password security? Well, really what it means is if a secure file that has a copy of your password is exposed on the internet, like it has been in many, many cases, how easy would it be for someone to leverage mathematics to break that encryption? So that's really a measure of 2 things: how readily guessable it is, how frequent it is, and how complex it is, how many statistical iterations they're going to have to go through before they actually hit on what your password is. So the first password, I really hope no one picked that, is terrible. That is not a password. Every dictionary list of passwords on the planet has that in it. And even though it, quote, checks all the boxes, it has all the complexity, different types of characters, it is not secure and would take 1 second is generous. The next password is what was considered a strong password under the PCI and NIST guidelines up until very recently. But this password, as you'll see, isn't really that secure. On modern computing equipment, we can actually break a password of that complexity and length very, very quickly. There's actually a cloud-based computing platform that you can use in Amazon Web Services that you can basically build a little farm to crack these passwords. So it's no longer you have to go out and spend millions of dollars on supercomputers. You just need to pay, maybe $1,000 to spin up some resources in the cloud, break into somebody's password, and then delete them all. And by the way, there's really no way for Amazon to distinguish those workloads, so it's not really reasonable to hold the cloud providers responsible for that. So then we come down to C and D. So both C and D are what I was talking about earlier, which is those passphrases. C is kind of a sentence that's pretty human readable and easy to remember. And D was actually generated by an online passphrase generator when I was writing this presentation. And you'll see that both of these are very strong. Obviously, C is stronger because there's some character complexity and some extra characters. But both of these, I think we could consider, if you require scientific notation to express how many years it would take to crack them, they're pretty secure. But keep in mind, this is also a moving target. So as computers become more advanced, especially with quantum computing on the rise, this may all turn on its head in 5 years. So what's a strong password in 2017 might not be a strong password even in 2020. The NIST guidelines that were just published really focus on the C password. So something that's easy for a human to remember, but something that would be very difficult to attack. It's a unique group of words. And yeah, it's possible they could have, a list of words and try to brute force it that way. But even doing it in that way, that password is still very strong and it's easy to remember. So when you're writing a password, make sure that, you're sort of following that rule. You want it to be something that's very long, preferably something 16 characters or more. But it doesn't have to be alphabet soup and it doesn't have to be unhumanly recognizable as long as it's not easy to guess for somebody else. So to kind of bring this all together, people are really the weakest link in security. And that's why user awareness training, like this presentation or corporate programs are really, really powerful in helping with making sure that you have effective security. We want to have those layered controls. So we want to have the firewalls and the phishing filtering software and the antivirus and all those tools. But at the end of the day, we're the ones clicking on all the things. We're really the source of all these attacks. So if we're extra careful and we're really aware of what's happening, it's all the better. If you're in an organization, it's worth considering doing some sort of formal awareness training similar to like sexual harassment and all the other trainings that you do for your new employees. And there's also something that you can do called a phishing simulation that's really effective, where you basically will have a mock phishing email go out. We do this with a lot of our security consultant clients. And we actually had one organization that the first phishing test that we sent out had a click rate in the 80%. I think it was like 84% of the people in the organization clicked on it. And after going through that process a little bit and realizing the mistakes that they were making, I think their last test, I think they had a click rate of somewhere around 4%. I think it was like one person in the organization who clicked it.
Yeah, I was one of those who made the mistake, so I admit it.
It wasn't 80% in our organization. Our organization was much, much better. I think our first email was somewhere in the 20s, and our last one, I think we actually had a 0% click rate, which made me very happy. So some things to do to help make sure that you stay secure. Stop and think before you click on a link, before you open an email attachment, before you provide personal information or passwords or complete a sensitive task. And that's really, a very broad bucket of things that you could almost qualify anything that you do on a computer as being one of those things. But it's really important to, sort of take a step back, and whenever people usually have really good senses for these kind of things, whenever that sense is tingling, whenever you're doing something, you're like, I'm not sure this is right, take that step back, really look at this, maybe forward it over to your IT folks to look at, and make sure that what you're dealing with is legitimate. And then even if you did something, you actually clicked on a link or you actually opened that attachment and you have that, this feels wrong sensation, still get somebody else involved. Make sure that your technology folks have an opportunity to really be able to protect you against whatever payload might have just detonated. We've had situations internally in the firm where somebody had that happen. They did something, they made a mistake, but they realized it immediately, and we were able to correct the issue before anything happened. Some other questions to ask yourself is, does this request seem strange or out of the ordinary? A lot of times if you get a phishing email, especially spear phishing, the request is going to be close but not quite there. Make sure you're questioning, is it possible someone's trying to trick me? Is this something that seems out of band? And can you confirm whether or not it's legitimate without doing what you're being told to do? So again, the example of the bank calling you on your cell phone and saying, oh, well, we need you to verify that it's you before we can talk to you, and insist that you give them either your social security number or your account number. Well, I'm not going to give that to you. I need you to verify with me that you are who you say you are without me actually divulging any personally identifiable information. We also want to talk about backups. So, we have all these controls, all these, security tools. We've got trained people. We've got, responsive IT. Everything is where it needs to be, but there's a, 0-day attack. Something comes out. We don't really know what it is. We're caught, blindsided by it, and we lost some data, and we need to get it back. Having good backups that are working and are tested regularly is critical. So you want to make sure that they're automatic. A manual backup that somebody in your office or in your home runs once a week or whatever. I'm sure they're diligent and they're responsible people, but people are fallible. They'll make mistakes. They'll get busy. Emergencies will happen, and they'll be distracted from making sure that those backups are happening when they're supposed to. So make sure that they're automatic, make sure they're continuous, so they're happening on a regular basis. Storage these days is really cheap, so there's no reason not to have plenty of capacity to take backups all the time. And you want to make sure that a copy of them at least is stored off-site. And that protects against incidences like that ransomware, where somebody's trying to crawl around in your network, find your backups, encrypt them first, and then go after your production data. If it's stored in another location, they can do whatever they want in your local network, and you're still fine because you have that data in another place. And last but not least, make sure that you understand and all of your users understand what locations are backed up, because you may have a corporate policy that anything stored on your desktop and your documents is saved, but in your downloads folder it's not. And so someone downloads a PowerPoint presentation that they're working on, and it's sitting in their downloads folder, and they make all these changes. They spend hours and hours working on it, and then they lose it. And they're like, oh, well, don't we have backups? Well, yes, we do, but not for the location you were working in. So make sure that you really know what those locations are. You train everybody on them, and that they understand what they need to do. So again, make sure that you stop and think before you click on links, open email attachments, give out personal information, or especially do any sort of financial transaction whatsoever. Don't send sensitive personal information through email, because email is a postcard. In some cases, you may have a secure email, which usually means you have to log into some really awkward portal and have a really complex password, and it looks like it was built in 1995. But if you get in there, then you're okay. But if it's any other type of email, if it's not secured, if it's not overtly encrypted, then you shouldn't have any confidence that it's going to be private. Make sure that you keep all of your software up to date. There are lots of tools out there that'll help you do this. Almost every software vendor on the planet has an automatic update option. Yeah, it's kind of frustrating to constantly get those pop-ups and say, hey, there's a new version of Java, there's a new Windows update. You have to restart your computer, and it's frustrating. But numerous attacks that have happened, over the years could have been prevented by that. A great example of that is the WannaCry incident that happened earlier this year. There was an update that was released by Microsoft that was out of band in March that they said, hey, this is a vulnerability, you need to patch it. And the attack happened 3 months later using that very same exploit. And I think it was a couple 100 million systems were compromised by it simply because people hadn't installed that update that was available for 3 months. So make sure that you're not in those groups of people whenever that happens. Know what locations are backed up, and make sure you know that the data that is sensitive and important to you is saved in those locations. And use a password manager to store strong passwords for each site and protect that with something similar to the passphrase that we showed in that slide.
All right. So, as we know, it's possible that elections could have changed because of issues with malware and passwords, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
system integrity is a huge challenge in any trusted system, voting, financial transactions, anything like that.
And another decision I think I'm going to make is grandma maybe wasn't so wrong in putting all her money under the mattress. So anyway, we want to thank you all very much for joining us. If you have any questions, please let us know, and you can always send them to us later on, and we will get back to you. Stay tuned for our next webinar that will come up in the next quarter. And as I said earlier, this webinar will be available in a couple of days on our website. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.